Hello everyone, welcome to Unit 2. So we are going to spend this unit talking all about the gear. We're going to talk about different types of cameras. We're going to talk about lenses and how they work and also how that affects your final image. And then we're going to spend some time just talking about managing your data, managing your files, and the best practices for backing up. So we are going to start now with a simple question. This first lesson is just called, what is a camera? Now, that's a very simplistic question that you guys know the big answer for. So we're not going to get into the simple things that maybe you already feel like you know. But what's important is that we all have a common vocabulary. So we are going to just go through in this unit some of the different terms and jargon that you're going to hear throughout this course. So before you jump into the content below, let's just do a quick overview of what you're going to be reading about. So first off, you're going to learn about what is the camera, and we're going to talk about the camera body as well as some of the important parts within the camera. So if we just look at the body, you guys all have your own cameras. Some of you are using phones, right? The essential part is the same. We need something that will record light and it will save it to some kind of device. So it could be film that it's saving it to, or it could be a digital sensor. If you're using any kind of digital camera, you have a digital sensor in there, whether it's a beefy thing like this or a phone. Now on the camera body, you obviously have, everyone's is going to look a little bit different, but you have your shutter button, you have your grip, you have different ways to change different settings on here. You have your viewfinder. One little trick here that sometimes people miss, if sometimes you feel like, well, I'm never getting focus, there's this little dial on the side of your viewfinder that's called your diopter. That can sometimes get knocked out of place and then everything looks out of focus. That's there for people to adjust the viewfinder to your own sight. So if you wear glasses, you might actually find that you can adjust this where you can actually use a viewfinder without your glasses. So something to look into. First thing to check, if you're like, I can't, every time I take a picture it's out of focus, it might be because this got shifted. So take a look at that. Inside the camera, in a digital camera, you will have your sensor. Now this is a mirrorless camera, meaning the sensor is just right there. In a DSLR, or the old version of it, an SLR, you will have a mirror on the inside. And that is what is recording through the lens and going up into your viewfinder. So when you're looking through your lens, you're actually bouncing off some mirrors into this prism at the top and then looking through the viewfinder. So you're looking through this set of mirrors. In a mirrorless camera, you're actually just seeing what's being recorded right on the sensor. These are called electric viewfinders. Some mirrorless cameras will have a hybrid. I'm looking at the Fuji X100 series, will have a hybrid. And the X Pro, I think, as well, has a hybrid. So you can see it as the electric, what you're seeing from the sensor, or optical, meaning you're seeing what's actually through the viewfinder. But on most mirrorless cameras, it's just an electrical viewfinder. So that's the basics of the camera body. The main part about a camera body is that it is light sealed and tight, so that the only light that's coming through is what's being recorded on either your film or on your sensor. We are also going to look at lenses. Now, one terminology that you'll often hear with lenses, you're going to hear the term prime lenses and zoom lenses. So I'm a bit of a prime whore, so I only have prime lenses. A prime lens means that it is one set focal length. You cannot change the focal length. So for example, this one is 50 millimeters on a full frame camera. This is 45 millimeters on a 35 millimeter film camera. And this one is 28 millimeter. Zoom lenses will have a range. So it might be something like 18 to 55. That means you can go as wide as 18 millimeters all the way up to 55 millimeters. Another thing that you'll find with lenses, the other number that you'll see, is your aperture, your base aperture and your maximum aperture. Your aperture, I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but your aperture are those little blades on the inside of your camera. You can see that little octagon there? That's your aperture. It will open and close when you take the picture depending on what you set it to. This is where it gets confusing. Smaller numbers, wider aperture. So if you're shooting at 1.8, you actually have it really wide open. There's more about that in the text, so don't stress if that's new information or confusing information. Some lenses will have a fixed aperture. This lens, this little pancake lens, is a fixed aperture, meaning I can't change it. So every time I shoot with this, I am shooting at, what is it? 4.5. And I know that because it says it on the lens itself. So in this unit, you're going to see all these numbers, and you're going to kind of figure out what these numbers mean. But that's just a quick introduction to that. So your camera body and your lens work together to project that information onto your sensor, or if you're using film, onto your film stock. You'll have a better idea about all this after going through the content below. If you are following along on Reddit, just know that on the actual website, there are some interactive elements in this unit. So I highly recommend going over to the website because I cannot input those into Reddit. So go on into the website and try out some of those interactive elements, read through this lesson. And in our next lesson, we are going to talk about different types of cameras. So I will see you all there. Okay, so we talked about the different components of the camera. You read through that. You hopefully did those interactive elements there just to get some more information about what's actually within the body and the lens of the camera. Now we're just going to look at some different types of cameras. Now, everybody is coming to this course with a different level and using different equipment. The reason that we even talk about this is because it's good to get familiar with what you have and to also know that a camera is a camera. You're going to have certain limitations one way or the other depending on what you're using, and you're going to have some advantages as well. So that it said, let's see what we have. So obviously we have phone cameras. The phone cameras have a little tiny sensor. A lot of them will have 2 different lenses on there now. These are great, obviously, for obvious reasons. You guys don't need to hear it, but you always have it with you, and they get better and better all the time. I just literally upgraded from an iPhone 10 like 3 days ago to an iPhone 12 mini, and I'm blown away by how good the 12 mini is in comparison to my 10. So they're always getting better. So don't discount this. I mean, it's a very trite saying that we hear all the time that the best camera is the one you have on you. Really what that means is that be able to work with what you have. If you don't have anything on you, then you miss the shot. But if you have your phone, you can at least use that. And they're very powerful, like I said. Then we can look at a couple film cameras as well. In the last video I showed you this. This is an SLR. So what we're missing from that is the D. Everyone's used to the D. The D stands for digital. So an SLR and a DSLR work very similarly. Like I said in the last video, you go through it, what comes through the lens bounces off some mirrors into the viewfinder and then records it onto the film or the sensor if it's a digital one. Another film camera that I love here, this is a TLR, a twin lens reflex. The way these work is a little bit different. So I'm going to pop this baby open at the top. This is where you look in. And then you'll notice when you look in, what you're actually looking through is this top lens here. And you are focusing through this top lens. This is the recording lens. These take 120 film. So they're quite big, they're quite beefy, and they're square shaped, which aesthetics and all that. But I love this camera. I love 120 film. It's just beautiful. This guy is from the 60s. made in Czechoslovakia, but you can get all different kinds of them. I'm just very partial to this one. That said, the SLR, this takes 35 millimeter film, which is the most common. That's what you probably, if you were a kid and you had a film camera, you were almost certainly using 35 millimeter. My first camera was one of those like little rectangular ones that took 110. Those are very hard to find now. And 35 is becoming increasingly expensive and hard to find, but you can still find it. So then we have DSLRs, which is this with a sensor. Obviously, a lot of you are going to be working with DSLRs, and then a lot of you are going to be working with mirrorless cameras. So like I said in the last video, a mirrorless camera is missing the mirror. Very clever. And it goes right into the sensor there. So what you are shooting goes right into the sensor. Like I said before, your viewfinder, as opposed to it being mirrors, because there aren't any, is electronic, unless you have a hybrid one, which allows for an optical viewfinder as well. Now, mirrorless and DSLR will come in various sensor sizes as well. We have micro four thirds. Pentax and Olympus make quite a few of those. It's just a smaller sensor. And then you have crop sensors. So Canon, Nikon, all the guys, Fuji, all Fujis, well, not all, now they have more, but most of the Fujis are crop sensors. Now this, honestly, this is something that people get really kind of stuck on, but it honestly doesn't, you don't really need to think about it as much as people do think about it. But we are going to talk about that a little bit more in the next lesson about focal length. Then you have full frame. Full frame is based on the 35 millimeter. So that's why it's called full frame. It's not the biggest one though. Weirdly, bigger than that, we have medium format. That's based on these guys. So medium format is the largest consumer one that you can get, but most people kind of cap out at the full frame if that's something you're concerned about. Now, the reason I say it doesn't matter too much is because it's really more about printing. So if you're shooting campaigns and you need to blow things up to, 8 feet, then you're probably going to want to look at a medium format or a full frame. But for just day-to-day stuff and walking around, it's not going to make a huge difference in your life. I just got this camera a few months ago. This is my first full frame ever. And it's cool, but it doesn't change how I interact and how I shoot. That said, when we do talk about focal length, it is something that we need to discuss because the millimeters, the focal length does shift depending on the size of the sensor and the way it's built. So that's something to keep in mind, and that's where that conversation comes up a lot, especially when people are trying to buy a camera and they don't really know. They just assume that full frame is better for everything because it's bigger. It's more about resolution size. Similarly, you hear people talk about pixels and, that's how they sell phones. All of this stuff is extra. When we're talking about what we're doing in this class, we're here to learn how to shoot what you want to shoot. And this stuff is something that you will, if you hit a limitation, you will know, because we're going to teach you how to shoot what you want to shoot. And if you find that, it's missing something, you will then know it. But don't feel like if you're shooting with a micro four thirds that it's somehow inferior to a full frame. That's actually practically, it's not really something that you need to think about too much. So that's my little spiel about sensor size. A lot of people will get into the weeds with it, so it's just something I wanted to point out. Other cameras that you might run into are compact cameras. My favorite camera I've ever had was my X100F. Wow, I forgot what letter. My X100F. And that compact camera or fixed lens camera means that the lens does not come off. What you see is what you get. There's a lot of advantages to that. You know what your focal length is. They're usually more pocketable. There's a lot of really good ones out there. Ricoh makes one that people go crazy over, for example. Don't discount those at all. So those are the main ones. There are some more exotic cameras out there as well. You have some ones with insane resolution. You have, more niche products. And then obviously things like drones and action cameras and things like that also exist. And those would fall into that as well. The reason that we're even here is to work with what you have. So think about what your camera allows for you to do and maybe what it holds back from you, and then that's what you should be concentrating on, not what everything else does. So concentrate on what yours does and take notes if there are any limitations, and then move on from there. Great, so in the next lesson we're going to talk about lenses, so I will see you all there. All right, so we are going to talk about lenses in this lesson. So let's talk about how lenses are built. Essentially, the lens has certain sections of it. It has our front element, which is just a fancy way of saying the glass in the front. Then on the inside, there is a lens group. This varies depending on the lens, how many pieces of glass are in there and the shape of them and so forth. Then in the middle is where your aperture is. Now, some of your lenses, you'll actually be able to shift the aperture on the lens itself. I'm not sure if you can see that, but let's see. You can actually open and close the aperture on the lens itself, which is something that I love. This one, just to show you, this is 16, and then it goes up to 2.8. That's what I thought. Or is it 2? It's 2, f2. So 2 to 16. So notice that 2 is really wide, 16 is really narrow. If that's confusing, you'll read more about it, don't worry. So then we have the aperture there, and then you have the rear element, which is the glass on the back. Different lenses are built differently, meaning the shapes of all the glass is different depending on the lens. This lens is all very curved. This lens, the rear element, is flat. Okay, so keep that in mind as well. That affects things like how your background, how it comes in and out of focus. That will come not just from the lens elements, but also from the aperture. But different lenses have different characteristics that come from that. So how do they work? In the simplest terms, light goes into the lens and then focuses and then projects that onto your sensor or your film. It uses all those complex glass and optical systems inside to get that focus, which also changes the basic output that you get from there. So we have our front element, that's the glass in the front. Then we have our lens group, which is multiple lenses arranged into a group. Then we have our aperture, which is the opening in the camera that lets light pass through it. And then we have our rear element, which is the glass at the back closest to the body. So in this unit, you will see a diagram right below to kind of show you what that looks like on the inside in a nice big macro lens, which my lenses are all tiny. So then on the lens itself, we have a bunch of numbers. This is everybody's favorite. What do all these numbers mean? So let's look. In the unit, you're going to see a little interactive. Again, if you're looking at this on Reddit, I suggest going over to the website and having a look, because we have a diagram that you can interact with to see those numbers. Now let's look at this lens. So if you look at the front of this lens, we see different markings. First, it says Minolta, that's the brand, and then Rokkor, that's what their lenses are. And then here you see where it says 45 mm 1:2. Does anyone know what that means? I can't hear you. 45 mm is the focal length. It is 45 millimeters. This is a prime lens. I cannot change the focal length. It is 45 all the time. 45 is a bit of a weird one, but I absolutely love this lens. This is one of my favorite lenses I've ever owned. What about the 1:2? That's our aperture, our maximum aperture. So the widest I can get on this is f2. This lens here, the widest, let's see, I'm going to let you see it and you tell me. So the widest this one can go, I don't know if yeah, that was in the right way, is 1.8. Okay, 1.8 is the widest aperture. That's pretty standard with, you know, you hear nifty 50 and 35. 1.8 is a nice wide aperture. So that's the widest this one can go. Then we have one other number here. See if you can see that. It's denoted with a circle with a line through it. Somebody can tell me what that's called because I can't remember. It's like the diameter symbol in geometry. Well, yeah, that's what that means. So that's your filter size. So that in this one, it's 49 millimeters. That means if I'm looking for filters for this, I need to find one that's 49 millimeters for my screw-on filters. You'll notice that lenses will have rivets, so that you can screw onto them. And that's the number you need. So on this lens, it's 49. And then the other lens I have here, there's nothing that we can screw onto it, so it doesn't have it. Because this is what we call a pancake lens, because it is completely flat, like a pancake. They actually call this the chip, and they weirdly have a woman eating it on the listing. Anyway, these are called pancake lenses. I'm a big fan of pancake lenses because they take any camera and make it look incredibly small. So that's what all those numbers are. Your lens may have some more numbers. So instead of saying 28 millimeters, it might say something like 16 to 35 millimeter. That would mean the widest focal length it has is 16, and the most zoomed in it can go is 35. Then for your aperture, it might say something like, instead of saying 1:4, which would be a 4, aperture of 4, or f-stop is another word that we use. It might have a range. It might say 4.0 to 5.6. What that means is that at your widest focal length, so if we're going back to the 16, at 16, you can use f4. You can use 4. But as you zoom in, and you get up to that 35 millimeter, you cannot use f4 anymore. Instead, the widest aperture you can use is 5.6. So take a look at the lesson, read through that, try out the interactive elements, and just get a better idea. And then go ahead and look at your lenses and see if you can identify all those numbers on your lens, or lenses if you have many. In our next lesson, we're going to talk about focal length. And this one's important because focal length does have an effect on your final output. So we're going to talk about that in the next video and in the next lesson. See you then. Okay, so we know all about our camera bodies. We know all about our lenses and those numbers on there. One of those numbers is your focal length. So what does that actually mean, and how is that going to affect your final output? Your focal length is literally what you can see. It is how zoomed in you are, and you might also hear it referred to as your field of view. So it's actually what you will see through the lens when you take the photo. It is a real number. It is expressed in millimeters. In the lesson below, you're going to read a little bit more about the technical parts of this and what that number is representing. The important thing for us to talk about right now is how it's going to affect your final image. So you will hear photographers use terms like shooting really wide or shooting really narrow. So if you are shooting with a wide focal length, that means you are getting a lot of that field of view in. So what kind of number are we thinking that would mean? It might seem a little backwards, but your field of view and your focal length The wider it is, the smaller the number. So if you're using a wide angle lens or an ultra wide angle lens and your lens says 11 millimeters on it, you are going to get a whole bunch of information in your field of view. If you are using a zoom lens or a more narrow lens, maybe something like 100 millimeters, that means you're getting a longer field of view. You're going to be brought in closer to the subject. So that's something to keep in mind. This is honestly a personal stylistic preference. In the middle, we have something called normal, and normal lenses would be the ones that are closest to what the eye sees naturally. So some people prefer that. Some people prefer those wide angle shots. Those are pretty common in like landscape photography, but they can also be really effective for fashion photography, all kinds of stuff. And then there are some lenses that are specific for one use. They're meant to be one use. So macro lenses or micro lenses, I believe Nikon calls them. Those are usually like 100 millimeters, I believe. And those allow you, the difference between those and like a regular longer lens is that they allow you to focus close up. So if you are interested into macro photography, it might be something worth looking at. There are other options as well, like macro tubes and things that will help you to focus in very close to your subject. But the reason we even talk about this is because it does kind of affect it does affect your final image. Now, in the first video, we did talk about our crop factor. I'm just going to gloss over this pretty quickly. In this lesson below, there is like a visualization of this, an interactive visualization of this. But essentially, the sensor size of your camera does affect the field of view. So if you are shooting on a micro four thirds camera or a crop sensor camera, those have a crop factor based on a full frame. So it really is meaning that your field of view is going to be more narrow. If you're shooting at 50 millimeters on a crop, that's going to be more, your field of view is going to be more narrow than that same 50 millimeters on a full frame. Like I said, there's a visualization of this below, so go down there and check that out. Again, this honestly gets talked about a lot, I think a lot more than it really needs to be, because you know what you're working with, you know what your lens, your field of view looks like when you look through the lens. So if you are concerned about it, like let's say you have a crop sensor lens camera and you know you like those really, really wide angle shots, just make sure you're looking at the crop lenses for that and get an idea of that field of view. Like I said, I think it's a little bit focused on more than it needs to be. Focus on your own stuff that you have and know what your field of view looks like dependent on your own gear. Now, one thing that is very true, there's actually, we're going to call this factor fiction. I'm going to have Riker come out here and talk to you about it, but there is this misconception about distortion that comes up when you are shooting at different focal lengths. And I'm sure you've heard it. I'm sure you've seen those GIFs of a face getting really bulbous and then getting really wide and really bulbous and really wide. And it says, oh, well, this is at 18 millimeters and this is at 300 millimeters. There's some truth to it, but the way that it's being presented is very misleading. It's not because they're using an 18 millimeter lens that the face is like this. It's not because of that. It's because of how close they had to get to the subject to put the subject nice and big in the frame. Okay, so keep this in mind. When you are shooting a portrait, this mostly comes up with portraits. When you are shooting a portrait and you have a longer lens, you're able to stand further away from the subject. So there's no distortion because the subject isn't right up on top of the frame. When you take a selfie with your phone, your face is pretty close, right? And it's a pretty wide angle lens on these, and your face is really close. So you get that kind of distortion there on your face. But if you pulled out or you had a friend take a picture with the same thing, they would have to get kind of far to get it so you're not super distorted. But then if you crop in, it's the same focal length and you look the same. right? So it's not about just the focal length. It's about the focal length plus how the focal length affects the distance that you are from the subject. This is super important because it gets passed around a lot and it's very misleading. You can take perfectly non-distorted portraits with a 18mm lens. It's possible. It starts to get distorted when you think, oh, well, I can't really see their face. Let me get really close to them. So keep that in mind. One thing that is true about focal length is compression. So what does that mean? That means your foreground, midground, background will get closer to each other with longer lenses. If you take a picture with a wide angle lens, and let's say there's a tree in front of a big forest, and you take that picture, those trees in the background in the forest, seem small. They're not really taking up a lot of the frame. And that tree in the front there is tiny and it's there and it's, it seems far away from the forest. But then if you zoom in and you zoom in and zoom in, the forest and the trees start to get closer together. The trees in the back seem bigger and you are compressing the information. When you see one of those pictures, for example, of the moon, like we got a lot of eclipses and things in the last few years, and there's a lot of pictures of the moon being huge and dominant behind maybe the Statue of Liberty. You know that when you take a picture of the moon with your phone, the moon to your eye looks this big and comes out this big. That's because you have a really wide lens on here. If you put on a 600mm and you took that same picture, the moon becomes huge. This is called compression. This one is real. Distortion is misleading. It's because of the distance. It's not just because of the focal length. It's because of the distance. Compression is real and can be a very effective tool to use. In this unit, if you go down, you're going to see an example of this. The same shot a few times at different focal lengths. And I want you to look at the stuff in the background and see how it gets bigger and closer to the stuff in the midground. That's what compression is. That's how compression works. And again, it's from longer lenses will bring everything close. It narrows the perceived distance between the elements in the image. That's a real thing. All right, soapbox away. Let's talk about focal ranges. So this is this vocabulary that I was talking about that we all need to kind of align on. So we have ultra wide angle lenses. I'm talking in full frame lengths right now just to keep things simple. But an ultra wide angle lens would be something like 14 to 24mm. I used to have a crop Nikon and I had a Tokina and I believe it was 11 to 16. So that's kind of you can see a crop sensor. That ultra wide becomes a lower number, 11, which would bring us closer to that 14 or 24. I'm not doing the math right now. So ultra wide in full frame is like 14 to 24. Then wide angle would be like 24 to 35. Normal, when you hear normal, it means it's the closest to what your eye sees. This is my personal favorite. I enjoy shooting with normal lenses. On a full frame, that's like 40 to 75. Mid-tele, these are great for portraits because you can be back from the subject, so you're not getting that distortion by getting close to their face. And then also you can compress some of the background behind them. So a mild tele would be something like 85 to 105. Then you have a medium telephoto. That's, again, these are all good for portraits. And also telephoto landscapes I think are beautiful. So don't discount these as just portrait lenses. They can be used for lots of things. So a medium telephoto would be like 120 to 300. And then long exotic telephotos, 300 to 800. 600 comes up a lot for bird photography, moon photography, stuff like that, where you need to get close to the subject without you can't with the moon, and birds you don't want to disturb. So a long or exotic telephoto would be a great solution for that. So learn what you have. What kind of lenses do you like? If you're using a variable focal length, you can find out what you kind of lean on. If you're using a kit lens that's like 18 to 55, go through and see like where most of your lenses land. Are you landing closer to the 55 or closer to the 18? And then if you decide to look at new lenses in the future, you know what you actually prefer. Great. So there's a lot more about that, but this is just to get you started and get you some of that vocabulary. In the next lesson, we're going to move away from the physical gear and we're going to start talking about post-processing and digital workflow, as well as backing up. So I'll see you in the next video. Okay, we are back. Hair is pulled back because we are about to get into post-processing. I know this is a big one for a lot of people. We are going to spend a whole unit on post-processing and some best practices when you do it. In this lesson, we're really just going to be talking about the difference between RAW versus JPEG and why you would choose one over the other. Some people, they start their photography journey, and influencers, I'll say, teachers, workshop presenters, people like me will say, well, you need to shoot in RAW. Everything should be shot in RAW. Oh, actually. Yeah, that's nonsense. First, a lot of people, JPEG is enough. So we're going to talk about why JPEG might be a good choice for you or why RAW might be a good choice for you. Remember, this is about you. It's not about what you're supposed to do. It's what works for you. So quickly, what is JPEG? JPEG is actually an acronym. It is an organization. They invented it. JPEG is the most common file type. That's the one that most of the pictures you're looking at online are mostly in JPEG. They are perfectly reasonable sizes and quality. You will hear PNGs being thrown around as well. PNGs just tend to be a little bit bigger, maybe have a little bit more information saved in them. But for general sharing, even working with clients, if you end up in the paid world, let's say you have portrait clients, you're probably going to be delivering JPEGs. Okay, so JPEGs are the most common. That's what you're finding. RAW is not a specific file type. Every camera has their own version. Camera manufacturer has their own version of RAW files. RAW files are basically the ingredients, the data that will be then cooked or created to make the image the way you want. So there's a lot more information in a RAW file than in a JPEG. It also means that you have to post-process it. You cannot just share a RAW file. You might think that you can because sometimes you'll see a picture and someone said this is the RAW. It's not really, it's the RAW that's then been converted into probably a JPEG and just the person didn't put any of their own post-processing on it. Now, the conversation often turns to, well, if you're editing RAW, what is cheating? What is too much? What is this? What is that? I want you to remember that a JPEG has also been post-processed. You just didn't do it. The camera did it for you. Now, some cameras will have profiles built into them. Fuji does beautiful ones. I haven't really explored my Sony ones yet because I like post-processing and I have my own version of that, my own color style and so forth. So for me, I haven't tried it, but I know they have some as well. And I believe every camera, I don't want to say every camera, but a lot of cameras have profiles built into them now that you can choose from. But when you export your pictures, or even when you just take a picture in JPEG, it has been post-processed by the camera in one way or the other. So are you a control freak that needs to make sure that every pixel has been seen by you and changed by you and addressed by you? Then you want to kind of move into RAW. Are you happy with the way the pictures come out of your camera? Do you hate post-processing? Do you not have the time? Are you just taking pictures for your own memories and you just want to get them up right away? JPEG is great for that. I kind of fall in the place where I shoot JPEG and RAW because sometimes you'll be out and you'll take a picture and you really love it and you want to share it right away and you don't want to go home and import it and all that. So I have the JPEG there that I can then just send to my phone and then send up to the space. And then go home and maybe work on the RAW file if I want to, or of the other images while I was out shooting. So this is entirely a personal preference. So let's talk about some benefits that each one has over the other. So when you are choosing JPEG, you are choosing a smaller file size, which means that you can fit more on that card of yours. You are choosing an ease of sharing, meaning it's much quicker and much easier for you to get that out to the world. It has a simplified editing and faster workflow because you don't need to edit it at all, and you maybe just want to organize it and put it somewhere safe. You can also do some in-camera adjustments with JPEG files. A lot of cameras will allow you to shift white balance, exposure, and stuff in the camera, and then just export it as a JPEG from your camera directly. And then this one doesn't get talked about a lot, but continuous shooting. So what that means is JPEGs are much smaller. So if you are shooting like sports, for example, and you want to make sure you get that perfect shot of the ball being kicked, and you hold down and you do continuous shooting like that, RAW files take a while to save to the card. JPEGs don't. They take much less time because they're much smaller. So you can hold it down and you can get this burst of shots really quickly. In fact, a lot of sports photographers and photojournalists shoot exclusively in JPEG, both for the speed of it and also because they need to get it to their editor right away. So they'll shoot all of them in JPEG and then they'll send them to whomever, their agency, right directly there on the scene. Photojournalists often have to shoot JPEG as well for journalistic purposes, just to make sure that nothing has been changed or processed by the photographer. So there are like actual professional applications of JPEG over RAW as well. There are some limitations, and I'm going to show that in a editing video below. But some of the limitations that you'll find is you can't really adjust white balance. When you do try to post-process JPEGs, you can't really be very subtle. It's very difficult to be very subtle. If you shift color, it's going to go like all the way over here, as opposed to being a little bit more careful and slow like you can with RAW. So you just don't have as much processing power when you are shooting in JPEG. But there are a lot of benefits to it as well, depending on what kind of photographer you are and what your ultimate goals are. So let's talk about RAW then. So some advantages to RAW. With a RAW file, you are getting a higher image quality. There is more data and more information stored in a RAW file than there is in a JPEG. You are getting a greater dynamic range, meaning you can pull back those highlights and shadows at a much better way than you can on a JPEG file. There's a lot of hidden information in a RAW file that you can't even see until you start moving those sliders around in your post-processing software. You have non-destructive editing. Most editing software is non-destructive, but with RAW files, you can always go back to that RAW file. Any adjustment you made can be taken out, can be altered at a later date. When you are finished with a RAW file, you export it as a JPEG or a PNG or a TIFF, whatever it is. JPEG is the common one, like I said. And then you still have that RAW file. So you have the new edit that you just did, but you still have the RAW file that you can always go back to. The big one for me is white balance adjustments. A lot of people are like, I don't know what white balance setting to put my camera in, you know, especially if I'm going inside and outside and I'm moving from tungsten light to daylight to this, to that. It doesn't matter when you shoot RAW. When you shoot RAW, you can completely change that white balance and it works with no issue. So in your post-processing software. So fine-tuning white balance is a huge one for RAW over JPEG. The same kind of goes for exposure. You have a lot more latitude with exposure, with color correction. Those things are definitely more adjustable in a RAW file than they are in a JPEG. Other editing options like sharpness, perspective, lens corrections, these are all much more adjustable with a RAW file. So again, the big thing for RAW, most of those things that I list are about post-processing. So post-processing doesn't matter to you, then consider that. There are some things that maybe are worth thinking about even if you are not a post-process kind of guy, but raw files have all of your sensor data on them. That means that it's very future-proof. It's like having the original film after you get your film developed. You can always go back and pull all that data back onto it. It's also a nice way to prove copyright, but we won't get into that right now. But if you have the raw file, you know, that's like having all the ingredients for the cake before the cake is made. So you can say, no, these are my ingredients. I can make the cake however I want later on. So that's just something to consider as well. As far as some disadvantages to RAW, they're quite big. So you won't be able to fit as many images on your SD card, but storage is relatively cheap now. So you can get more smaller cards or more bigger cards, and kind of keep that in mind as well. I do recommend, you know, formatting your card regularly. So making sure that you put that information somewhere else. And we're going to talk about that in our next lesson here. But raw files are quite big, and they do require you to post-process. So those are the two big disadvantages to them, unless you like post-processing like me. So keep that in mind. Below, you're going to see a couple of videos just demonstrating what it actually looks like when you try to post-process a raw file versus a JPEG. So take a look at those, and then I'll see you in the last lesson of this unit. Okay, so let's now talk about digital workflow. How do you go from taking all those photos to getting them home, getting them on your computer or in the cloud or on your phone or on your iPad, and making sure that they are safe and together where you need them to be? So what happens after you take that shutter button and you have an image? This is our workflow. What do we do next? You want to kind of think of this as like a pipeline or a conveyor belt, that each step takes the result from the previous task, meaning what you do next is because of what you did first. The whole process of organizing your images and other files is called digital asset management, or DAM. So think of it that way. Think of how you're managing your digital assets. You should start to pay attention to this sooner rather than later. This unit, this lesson was in the class way further down, like I think in like March. We decided to move it up because the sooner you get into good habits with this, the better off you are. Okay, so how do you do this? It's really up to you. There are digital asset management softwares that you can use that will help you to keep your material organized, your files organized. And it also is a nice way to kind of visualize everything you have. So obviously some ones that people know are Adobe Lightroom, Apple Photos does it. There's some free ones, Darktable, Ansel, Digicam. All of these things allow you to organize your images and visualize them, and some of them also allow you to edit them. Most of them do. But how do you organize? What's the best way to do that? We're going to look at my process in another video after this. So this video is just kind of introduce you to the idea of start thinking about it. So go through, read this first section here, and then we're going to look at how I organize my images, and which is not the end all be all, but just to give you an idea of what are some ways that you can start organizing your stuff. The other thing you really need to start thinking about is your backup. How are you backing up all of this information? There are lots of different ways you can do it. One method that comes up quite a bit is the 3-2-1 method. It's a nice simple way to remember this. But essentially you should have at least 3 copies on 2 different types of media storage, and 1 should be off-site. So if you have stuff on a hard drive, a physical solid-state hard drive at home, maybe you have other versions in the cloud, or maybe you have another hard drive that you bring to a friend's house, the office, in case of, fires, floods, whatever. And then you kind of switch them back and forth. But you should have multiple versions of everything. I will tell you a personal story. I went to film school a billion years ago, and every single one of my college films is lost. It's gone forever. I had them on a hard drive, and like I said, this was 1,000 years ago, and the hard drive was like this big, and it needed to be plugged into the wall to even work. And after college, I moved to London, and I brought it with me. And then when I had to leave London, I left a box in the basement and asked my housemate to send it back to me. And I think you can guess where this is going. It never made it to me. I went back to London like 6 months later, and none of my housemates were living there anymore, but I went and knocked on the door and I said, please let me go look in the basement. But it was gone. So somewhere out there, there's a huge hard drive that may or may not even work anymore with all of my college films on it. That was a rough lesson to learn. So I don't want you guys to learn that lesson. I'll also add that this was before YouTube. There was a different service that we shared our videos on that I can't even remember. It was before YouTube, before Vimeo. So they're up there on some server somewhere, but I'll never see them again. So just keep that in mind. Don't let that be you, and make sure that you have various backups in various forms of media. All right, this is the last unit, last lesson in this unit. After this, after you get through all of this, you're going to find a quick knowledge check, a quick quiz to take. Go through that, and then head on into your assignment for this unit. All right, we have made it through Unit 2 now. It's time to talk about our assignment. Now, this was a very gear-heavy unit. It was all technical stuff, but we're going to have a little bit of fun, and we're going to try to do a little bit of creative thinking with this assignment. So the TLDR of this assignment is that you are going to be creating a cohesive photo series. 3 to 5 photos are going to be your final deliverables. Now, this photo series should be about a mini photo story of some kind of event. It doesn't have to be a real event. If you have some kind of festival happening, go ahead and, show us the story of that. But it could be something like waking up in the morning and making a cup of coffee. It doesn't have to be anything extravagant. Use your own creativity for this. And go ahead and make us a photo story. Now, there are some intricacies with this assignment that do relate back to the unit. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to choose your subject or your event. It could be a quiet moment. It could be an actual party. But you're going to be trying to tell us a very small story documented through 3 to 5 images at the end. You are going to use 2 approaches for this. That means if you have one of these guys and one of these guys, you should be taking photos on both of them. If you have 2 different focal lengths, that could be your 2 approaches. But essentially what we want you to do, is we want you to use more than one focal length, more than one camera to document this event. And we want you to kind of understand by doing this how the equipment, your phone or your camera, or how the different focal lengths actually affect your final images. So you should be paying attention to that. You should be very sensitive to that because we are going to ask you to reflect on it. What you should be focusing on in your pictures themselves are your exposure and your composition. If you are not comfortable with any kind of manual settings yet, I don't expect you to be. We haven't done that yet. So go ahead and use auto mode. That's totally fine. If you are comfortable with some manual settings and you prefer them, go ahead. That's not what's important here. What's going to be important here is your composition and your exposure, because composition comes a lot with our focal length and exposure does as well. So go ahead and do that. As far as RAW versus JPEG, if you can, I would suggest shooting in RAW plus JPEG and storing that RAW file away for a future assignment. We will use those RAW files then. But you're going to be presenting us with your JPEG. You're going to choose your final images We don't want any edits on this. We want these to be straight out of camera JPEGs. If you do want to, you know, straighten them or something like that, or if your phone or camera has any built-in profiles, you know, different color profiles or black and white or whatever, go ahead and use those. But we don't want you bringing these into a post-processing software and moving around sliders. Not today, not for this assignment. So basic cropping, basic straightening, okay. In-camera profiles, okay. You're going to organize these files, so transfer them onto your computer or into the cloud or folders on your phone, and organize them in a way that makes sense for you. And then, you know, make sure you're labeling your images so that you can find them again in the future. You are then going to submit these 3 to 5 images onto either the Discord or the subreddit. And you are going to highlight one image from each approach. So there should at least be one camera phone picture and one phone picture. If you're using 2 different lenses, there should be at least one from each of them. And then you're going to write a little reflection. What did you photograph? Why did you photograph it? And then think about how the different choices with focal length and so forth changed your final images or changed how you actually approached taking the pictures, and write that in a quick reflection, short paragraph. You should also kind of pop in what kind of feedback that you'd like from the mentors. Are you looking for more technical stuff, or are you looking for more compositional or narrative? Whatever it is that you think you want to hear some additional thoughts on, just give us a little note on that to help the process along. So that's it. If you want to kind of make it a game, you can, by not telling us which picture was taken with the phone, which picture was taken with a wide angle, and let's see if your peers can guess and say, oh, I think that one was the phone picture. I think that one was the zoom lens. So go ahead and do that. That's a fun way to kind of get people looking at your photos in a more critical way, and also practicing for themselves, you know, identifying things like focal length. And also, you might be surprised at which ones were made with a phone versus which ones were made with a camera. And that's it. We have some regular events coming up on the Discord, including a little very casual chat about this unit. So if you want to pop over to the Discord and check the events tab at the top, you're going to see the date and time for all of these. Keep in mind that the time is in your time zone, so you don't have to ask what time is it, when is it. It's in your time zone on the Discord. So check that. Don't forget to write in your learning journals as well. If you haven't gotten it yet, you can still buy a physical copy or download the PDF. And that's it. I'll see you guys on the Discord and in the Reddit. And for Unit 3, which is all about photography basics, we're going to get into settings and more compositional guidelines, things like that, color theory, my personal favorite introductory unit. So I look forward to that, and I'll see you all then. Thank you, and well done with Unit 2.